Is there a fourth quest for the historical Jesus underway? And what exactly would set such a quest apart from the first three quests? These are the kinds of questions that we'll be exploring in this interview, and I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Craig Blomberg. He is emeritus professor of New Testament at Denver Seminary, and he's also the author of this new book titled Jesus the Purifier, John's Gospel and the Fourth Quest for the Historical Jesus. It's a wonderful, wonderful book, and really it has kind of two functions. It serves as a kind of overview of the quest for the historical Jesus, but also lays some of the groundwork for a fourth quest. So thank you very much for joining me, Dr. Blomberg.
Thank you for having me.
Let me first ask you, how did you get interested in historical Jesus research?
My goodness, I suppose that would go back to very early in my Christian life as a teenager when I would talk to people about Christ, and sometimes I would try the C.S. Lewis approach and say, Jesus either had to be a liar or a lunatic or else Lord. And I discovered that there was a fourth L circulating, that maybe he was a legend, or at least that a good chunk of the New Testament Gospels were legendary, and that in fact scholars for a couple of centuries had been trying to determine which parts of the Gospels could be treated as historical and what picture of Jesus emerged if they did that. So maybe 45, 46 years ago.
Yeah, you've been doing this for a long time, and I own many of your books. They're wonderful. They've helped me a lot as I've studied these topics. So let me first ask you, what do scholars mean when they refer to the historical Jesus?
Different things. So when you hear somebody use that term or read it, it's important to try to figure out from the context what they mean by it. But a pretty good cross-section of folks these days by it would mean what we can know of the human being, Jesus of Nazareth, Jew from the first third of the first century, and what can we know of him by historical research alone, which by definition will not be everything one might know about him or any other figure from the ancient world when so much information has been lost. But without presupposing any Christian faith, what can we say with some degree of confidence?
In the first half of the book, I mentioned this a few minutes ago, in the first half of the book, you give a survey of the three quests for the historical Jesus. And I figured we'd use the first half of this interview to, and it might take even less time than that, but we'd spend a few minutes here at the beginning, just summarizing some of that survey that you cover. So first, let me ask, who are some of the key figures in the first quest for the historical Jesus, and what are the major views that emerged from it?
Well, the key figure is the one who many would say brought the first quest to an end, but we start with him because he also coined the expression. A man writing right at the beginning of the 20th century, who is perhaps best known for being a medical missionary doctor in what at the time was French West Africa, today would be the country of Gabon. Albert Schweitzer a man who lived into his 90s. I looked up the year he died in 1965, which confirmed that my memory of seeing him interviewed on National Geographic on a black and white TV that my parents had to be before I turned 10. And man with white hair going off in all directions. It actually won the Nobel Peace Prize in the 1950s. But early in his life, he did a doctorate in psychiatry, another one in New Testament studies. He was a concert organist, a quite amazing individual who wrote a book that in English is referred to, he wrote it in German, but the English translation dubbed it The Quest of the Historical Jesus. And he surveyed from the rise of modern biblical criticism somewhere in the mid to late 18th century onwards, a whole raft of people and perspectives who tried to address this question. If we do not start with the dogma of the Christian church, what may we nevertheless conclude about Jesus of Nazareth from history, and what difference does it make? And he pointed out that in the earliest period, this was the time of the rise of deism and the rise of rationalists who believed there was a God, but he did not intervene supernaturally into this universe. Everything could be explained through a system of cause and effect, sort of a early scientific method. And so these were people who gave rationalist explanations for the miracles of Jesus, or they simply left them out of the picture altogether. And a man by the name of Heinrich Paulus, early in the 1800s, may be the most famous writer from this perspective. He talks about men who saw Jesus as a revolutionary, Samuel Reimarus being perhaps the most significant individual there, of those who thought that much of the Gospels were based on Greek and Roman mythology. And David Friedrich Strauss in the middle of the 19th century was a key figure there. The French Romantic Ernst Renan represents another key school of thought, and Adolf von Harnack in Protestant liberalism, the so-called Old Social Gospel movement. And then he comes down to his day and sees that really the choice is between a man by the name of William Vereda, who believed that Mark himself was responsible for creating much of the picture of Jesus as divine, so-called high Christology, the messianic secret motif, that the reason we read about Jesus silencing people so many times when they recognize who he is that was a literary device of Mark's creation. Jesus never really did claim or acknowledge acclamation as Messiah, but the early church invented it, and this was their method to explain how he was indeed the Messiah, but nobody had heard him make these claims, or very few people had. Schweitzer rejected that and instead proposed a picture of Jesus as a thoroughgoing eschatological prophet, believing that his ministry was bringing about the kingdom with which world history as we knew it would end. Unfortunately, that did not happen. And so from at least one point of view, Jesus died a failure. But from another point of view, his spirit, there's no sense that Schweitzer really accepted a bodily resurrection, but he certainly believed the Spirit of Christ lived on, that we can be united as believers with that Spirit and be empowered to do the great things that he taught about. And he proceeded to devote his life to one piece of that kind of activity. He brought the quest in many people's minds to an end because, in essence, although in the book I point out that you have to throw in an awful lot of caveats to make this stand, but the way it's often described is that people remade Jesus in their own image or in the image of the school of thought to which they belonged. And then the claim was, I don't think it's accurate, but the claim was that Schweitzer did the same thing. Whether or not it was accurate, it convinced enough people, along with other events that were going on in the world, not least 2 world wars in the first part of the 20th century, to really diminish the amount of attention in the scholarly world for historical Jesus research.
Yeah. Okay, so Albert Schweitzer, main figure, and this isn't going to do it justice, but he was a major figure in promoting the kind of failed apocalyptic prophet view of Jesus. Okay, what about the second quest for the historical Jesus? Who were the main figures in it, and the major views that emerged?
After World War II, a reunion of students of a professor who was a towering figure in New Testament studies in the New Testament scholarly world, Rudolf Bultmann. A reunion of his students in Marburg, Germany, bringing together German scholars, including Ernst Käsemann, Gunther Bornkamm, Hans Kanzelmann, and an American by the name of James Robinson, held a colloquium at which Käsemann in particular gave a paper called The New Quest of the Historical Jesus. And it was their conviction that during the previous 50 years or so, those people that had continued to write about Jesus, and particularly Bultmann, had been much too skeptical, at times thinking that we could know next to nothing about the Jesus of history. And so they wanted to embark on a new quest. They wanted to refine criteria that various people had already proposed, criteria of authenticity, to create a kind of agreed on approach of these are the historical criteria that we will use to see what passes muster that we can accept out of the Gospels. For the average Christian, it probably still did not seem like a lot of the Gospels, even just in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, were accepted. And yet one of those men, Gunther Bornkamm, was able to write in about 1960 a book on Jesus. I used it as an undergraduate college textbook at a Lutheran college in the early 1970s, that had quite a detailed summary of events and particularly teachings of Jesus that, with varying degrees of confidence, we can acknowledge were things that Jesus did and said. What was conspicuously missing was any form of recognition that he was Messiah, much less divine, and any clear belief in a resurrection. But compared to previous decades, things were moving in a more hopeful trajectory. One of the problems was that this was still largely a German endeavor, and those American scholars who were either trained in Germany or trained by those who had been trained in Germany. And so some latent anti-Semitism still seemed to appear where Jesus could most be trusted. The Jesus of the Gospels was where he was the most different from Judaism, because there still was this sense that Judaism, as it had evolved by the first century, was not a desirable religious worldview.
Okay. Anything else you want to say about that second quest?
Not unless you have a specific question.
Okay. No, we're making good time. We're making good time. All right. So the third quest, what are the major views that emerge from it and some of the key figures?
Somewhere around the 1970s and early 80s, again, there seemed to be a diminution, tailing off of interest in Jesus research. And while there were precursors that some would include, certainly by the time in 1985 that a scholar by the name of E.P. Sanders, notice the name is not German, he was an American who taught both in Canada and England, and finally in the last stages of his career for many years at Duke, wrote a book called Jesus and Judaism. A simple title, but a significant one, in that he called for, and those who have most enthusiastically identified with the third quest would agree, we need to be looking for a Jesus who makes full sense as an early first century Jew who lived in Israel, who grew up in Galilee, who ministered primarily in Galilee, who was crucified outside the city walls of Jerusalem, and that whatever else fledgling Christianity was, it was birthed as a Jewish movement. And so criteria needed to be revised, new ones were proposed, various ones were discussed. There was a concern not merely to somewhat atomistically go through and identify key sayings or deeds as the most historically probable, but to ask questions of aims and goals, purposes, worldviews, broader synthetic questions that help make sense of the whole of Jesus' life, rather than trying to build up a whole just from lots of little puzzle pieces. Tucked into the middle of this, in the mid to late 90s and continuing on from there for some time, was the emergence of the Jesus Seminar, which in many ways was a throwback to Boltzmann, and in their own words, a conscious continuation of the new quest. Men like Robert Funk, who organized it, and the co-chairs, Marcus Borg and Dominic Crossan, who were for 10 or 20 years almost household names of any for any Americans who paid any attention to religious news. They gathered a group of, at times, upward of 100, close to 200 scholars, although it didn't stay that large, who 3 or 4 times a year over a period of time would gather and vote on how likely it was that Jesus said or did something. So right back to the new quest approach, and right back almost to Bultmann's level of skepticism. Unfortunately, people writing about developments sometimes just talked about the third quest as chronologically the most recent group of studies, which masked the fact that this one group of scholars was taking a quite different approach than what in fact had become the majority and what probably deserved to be called third quest. This was also a time of a growth in interdisciplinary studies, understanding better the sociology of first century Israel. This was a time in the growth of the use of apocryphal and other later Christian traditions about Jesus, interpretations about Jesus. So in some sense, it returned to the breadth of different conclusions that one saw in the 19th century. But if anything unified it, it really was a sense of whatever you say, you have to paint a portrait of Jesus who is convincing within a first century Jewish milieu.
Yeah. So obviously in the book, this, I think it's almost 200 pages that you spend on this kind of survey of the quest. So we can't do that justice in just 20 minutes, but hopefully that gives the viewers a pretty good taste of what they can glean if they pick up the book. And I would encourage them to do that. It seems like a really nice summary. I think there's this new, pretty recent, like 2-volume work by Colin Himmer. Or no, who is it by?
Colin Brown, that
Colin
Craig
Brown, that's right.
Evans helped to edit posthumously. Yeah.
So that one will be, if you want to go really, really in depth. But if you just want a nice survey in a pretty short amount of space, this is a good place to start, I think. So I was going to go ahead and transition into the second half of the book, if that's okay with you.
Mm-hmm.
To me, this is some of the most, I guess, groundbreaking stuff. A lot of this I just wasn't aware of. So this is really neat. One of the things that you start out by saying is that while these quests for the historical Jesus are going on, there's a kind of field of research that wasn't getting maybe as much attention, or at least I wasn't aware of it. It's called the New Look at John. So can you just explain what this New Look at John is?
If I can start even further back, it was probably Friedrich Schleiermacher, the famous German philosopher, roughly around 1840, who was the last historical Jesus scholar to actually use John in a very significant way. Schleiermacher argued that John was the most philosophical gospel, and Schleiermacher was interested in philosophy, and so he created a portrait of Jesus that fit in the synoptic material around an outline provided by the Gospel of John. But from shortly thereafter, and for roughly another 150 years, the vast majority of all historical Jesus scholars simply found John too different from the synoptics, that if they were going to derive their picture of Jesus largely from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, then John just had to be laid to one side because he couldn't simultaneously be true. Even in the latter 20 years or so, the third quest period in the 20th century and now on into the 21st century, evangelical scholars who might object to treating John so skeptically, still, for the purposes of their scholarship, would just look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, maybe with the very stray reference here and there to John, just so they didn't have more of an uphill battle, a bigger wall to climb by arguing for John. But back in the late 1950s, a bit of an iconoclastic Cambridge-based scholar and bishop in the Anglican Church, John A.T. Robinson, who on the one hand was one of the theologians during the 60s that, while he was not one of the death of God theologians, he certainly had much more sympathy for a very human Jesus than a Jesus that was divine. Robinson was also fascinated by the Gospel of John and all kinds of little details that for him rang more historically true even than what could be found in the Synoptics. So he wrote an article at the tail end of the 1950s called The New Look on John, and then a book that he had nearly finished when he died in 1983, I believe it was posthumously edited by a colleague and published in 85 as The Priority of John, in which, much to the astonishment of much of the scholarly world, he argued for quite a lot of the distinctive features in John to be historically reliable, at times even at the expense of the Synoptics. So it's the cleansing of the temple in John 2, at the very beginning of his public ministry, that makes sense historically for Robinson, not some cleansing on what we would call Palm Sunday or right after that during the last week of his life. Robinson generated a lot of interest and a good smattering of people, some of them evangelical, but not by any means all of them, began to write various studies of John and to one degree or another follow in Robinson's stead, but it never amounted to a large enough body of research to capture the fascination of historical Jesus writers. And so the two lines of study sort of went on parallel tracks without intersecting or interacting very much. I wrote a book that came out in 2001 called The Historical Reliability of John's Gospel. And in some ways, it was a thought experiment put in writing, where I took a criterion that several people had developed independently in the 1990s for synoptic study, and said, what if we apply what was called the criterion of double similarity and double dissimilarity? I'll explain that if you want me to, and not if you don't. Ask about it. It showed great promise working with the synoptics. What if it was applied to John? And I argued that in almost every passage or episode in John's gospel, there was a significant core that passed that criterion quite well, so that even if we couldn't on historical grounds alone talk about the accuracy of every detail in John, there was a good outline of the gist of the major events that came out looking quite good. Little did I know that the year after that book appeared, and I'm guessing this may be where you want to turn next, a man by the name of Paul Anderson, a longtime scholar at George Fox University, would start a seminar at the Society of Biblical Literature, the largest international organization for biblical scholars from any perspective, that was called John, Jesus, and History. 3 words you didn't see put together in the same title that often, certainly in those days. And that launches us into what they increasingly began to call a fourth quest.
Yes, I want to explore some of the conclusions that they came to. And then I want to look at specifically what you argue for in the book and develop. So I guess maybe what were some of the conclusions that they came to, and then we'll shift into your contribution here.
Each person might have a slightly different list, but pretty widespread consensus that we should accept the unique features of John that included a period of overlap between his ministry and that of John the Baptist, including Jesus' baptism by John, which interestingly is not explicitly narrated in the fourth gospel, although a lot of the events immediately surrounding it are. The idea that we find in John 3, when the Baptist says, he must increase and I must decrease, that there was a period of time in which John was better known and more popular than Jesus, but that gradually those roles reversed. The fact that we read in both John 3 and 4 that Jesus, at least through his first disciples, baptized people, something we would not have known of for sure from any of the synoptic gospels, which may account for why, although we hear nothing more about that during Jesus' ministry, the moment we turn to Acts 1 and 2 and the beginning of the fledgling church, the coming of the Spirit at Pentecost, part of what the apostles say when asked, what should we do, is be baptized. And that becomes a major initiatory rite for early Christianity. Something about that first cleansing, if there is only one cleansing, then it's John's that will be accepted as historical. It makes better sense, they would say, at the outset of his ministry. Some historical core to the dialogues with Nicodemus and the Samaritan woman, if for no other reason, then they fit so well the consistent conflicts we see in the synoptics and Jesus' consistent interest in, care about, preference for, we might even say, the outcasts of his world. The 3-year chronology, give or take a few months, that lay Christians have regularly associated with Jesus' public ministry comes only from the Gospel of John, and all of the various references to when Jesus would travel to Jerusalem at one of the annual festivals, and some of the imagery that he would build on unique to those festivals, like the light of the world and the living water at the Feast of Tabernacles in John 7. And then as you look at the miracles of Jesus, what's fascinating is that John always calls them signs, pointers to who Jesus was. Now, that, the fourth quest, or some in it might say, is the theological overlay. But at the heart, especially with miracles of healings, especially as how some of them are remarkably similar to what we see in the synoptics. The lame man by the pool of Bethesda in chapter 5, when Jesus heals him, says, "Pick up your mat and walk," the identical words that he says to the lame man he heals who was lowered through the roof in a house at Capernaum in Mark chapter 2. Incidental little details like in the feeding of the 5,000, where it's the one miracle common to all four gospels. Whatever Jesus did, at the end of it, it's only John in John 6:15 who says, "Then they came and tried by force to take him and make him king," recognizing some kind of royal claim, some kind of messianic claim in this one who could provide bread in the wilderness like Moses of old in the days of the manna. And then when you get up to the time of Jesus' death and resurrection, you start to have more overlap with the synoptic gospels, but still there are incidental little details, some of them bigger than incidental. The foot washing of John 13, which is only in John's gospel, and yet seems to fit so well with that statement that's found only in the synoptics when Jesus says, "The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many." Little details like, why did Pilate need to be involved? There's nothing in Matthew, Mark, or Luke to explain that. The Sanhedrin found Jesus guilty of blasphemy. The Mosaic law made it very clear what that meant. Take him out, stone him to death. No hint of anybody starting those proceedings with Jesus, but rather turning him over to the Roman procurator, Pontius Pilate. But it's John 18:31 that gives the explanation. 31. I hope I got the right verse there. It's in John 18, where it says that under Rome, the Jews had no right to put anyone to death. The power of capital punishment had been taken away. I could keep going, but I think you get the idea. It's not saying that the whole package fits the criteria, but little and big details in almost every major section along the way.
You mentioned a moment ago the criterion. I always have to think about that when I say it. Criterion of double dissimilarity. Why don't you go ahead and say something about that here?
In the days of Bultmann and then of the New Quest, one of the foundational, perhaps the foundational criterion was the notion that where Jesus is described as saying or doing something that it's just hard to find precedent for or even to imagine any other Jewish person of that time doing it. And when that same detail or theme is not something that was a major focus of the early church, even within the rest of the pages of the New Testament, then who would have made it up if Jesus didn't do it? And why would they have made it up if nobody else was doing it? So you take something like the kingdom of God, Jesus as king. God as king is presupposed throughout the Hebrew scriptures, but that actual phrase, the kingdom of God, his kingly reign, does not appear once. It appears a dozen or more times in the rest of the New Testament, but not the 80-some that you find in the Synoptic Gospels alone. It doesn't seem to have been as meaningful outside of Jewish territory. And although it was meaningful in Jewish territory, it wasn't a term that had been used exactly in that form. So kingdom of God must be central to what Jesus was about. That's, I think, a valuable approach, but sometimes it was combined with, but if something does sound too much like other Jewish beliefs or individuals' practices, and something that Paul, James, Peter, John all stressed as much as Jesus did, and on to the 2nd century, then we can't say that somebody else might not have invented it, so we leave it out of our database, rather than simply saying we don't know what to do with it. The criterion of double similarity, in essence, said you would expect Jesus to have been, once in a while, a reasonably conventional Jew, and you would have expected the early church, maybe more often than once in a while, to have preserved his emphases. So put those together, and what several people in the third quest, and what I tried to do in my first book on the reliability of John's gospel asked was, can we find details where there are key distinctives between Jesus and conventional Judaism in the early church, but not to such a degree that they begin to appear implausible or even anachronistic. I could have Jesus crossing the Jordan on a motorboat, and nobody ought to believe it, because we're hundreds of years away from anything like the invention of a motorboat. But that would certainly be dissimilar from first century Judaism in the early church. So we need to find that right combination. And as a result, more things start to pass muster. What do we do with turning water into wine? Well, if you don't believe that kind of miracle is possible, then you're going to dismiss it, but that's the end of the conversation. But is it significant, not simply that, that's kind of unlike anything anybody else did that we know about, but also that John 2:6, in a narrative that is otherwise very sparse with detail, says that Jesus asked the servants at this wedding to fill with water 6 stone jars used for the Jewish rites of purification. Would anybody at a later date, less familiar with the Jewish landscape, even know to consider that as an option? And is it coincidence that in the synoptics, but not in John, Jesus has an expanded little metaphor, almost a short parable, in which he talks about new wine requiring new wineskins, something about the newness of the kingdom that can't be contained in the old forms and the old models or patterns, which seems to be the point of the miracle in John 2 anyway. Now I may have something else that previous quests wouldn't have accepted, but I've got reason to accept.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we're getting near the end here, and I want to ask you to. You already gave an example there, but if you want to give some other examples of the theme of ritual purity in
Right.
John's gospel, because I'll flash the book one more time just so people can see it. You call it Jesus the Purifier. So we want to try and connect the dots here. What exactly, why do you Schweitzer might say Jesus the failed apocalyptic prophet, but you say Jesus the Purifier. So I want to connect it with this kind of portrait of Jesus in John.
The current thought experiment, if we want to use that expression again, is, let's say, for the sake of discussion, that John does have a lot of theological overlay that may or may not be historical. Won't necessarily accept that, won't reject that premise, just for the sake of argument. What is left at the core of some of these sometimes quite long passages with lots of details in John's gospel? What are the things that don't appear to be, pick a number, among his top 15 theological emphases? Well, you can go to all kinds of introductory textbooks that list the major distinctive themes of each gospel, and you will, I would almost say never, but sooner or later somebody would find one, virtually never see anything about purity in those lists. And yet, in passage after passage, much more noticeably than in the synoptics, something is going on oftentimes involving water, but also involving either ritual or moral purity, or both. Baptism, those stone jars, cleansing the temple. You must be born of water and the Spirit, Jesus to Nicodemus. You would have asked me, and I would have given you rivers of living water, to the Samaritan woman. A lame person wanting to get healed by being unable to get into the pool of Bethesda, but Jesus bypasses it. Places like the feeding of the 5,000, where conspicuous in its absence is any opportunity for these crowds to wash their hands and be ritually pure before eating. More living water in John 7 at Tabernacles, the healing in the pool of Siloam in chapter 9. Jesus relating to the feast of dedication, the feast of purification, the re-purifying of the temple after the Maccabean revolt, still celebrated at Hanukkah. The amazing re-purification of Lazarus, it's called a resurrection. Mary anointing Jesus in Bethany, the foot washing ceremonies. Tucked into the upper room discourse is the statement about Jesus pruning the branches that remain attached to the vine, using the verb katharizo, at least in John's Greek translation, which normally means purification. Jesus sanctifying himself and praying for the disciples' sanctification in his famous prayer in chapter 17. And I know you want me to end this long summary. And so it strikes me that deeply embedded in John's gospel at the historical level, if there is any, is this theme of purity, which you then find in the synoptics, not so much surrounding water imagery, but simply in terms of the people Jesus associates with, the issues like the defilement of corpse impurity that doesn't seem to bother him, or the woman with the prolonged intermittent flow of blood, which would have rendered her impure. He goes out of his way to touch a leper when we know he can heal even from a distance without touching anybody. But instead of rendering himself impure by coming in contact with the impure, he makes the impure pure. He makes the unclean clean. So there's the climax. I wrote a book several years ago on contagious holiness, Jesus' meals with sinners, that made that point out of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But now we find John making that point, but in some different ways. Could it be that issues of purity, ritual, and moral maybe ought to be in our textbooks and not just in our list of key themes for John, but list of key things that the historical Jesus was all about? What would happen if the church took seriously that it could have a purifying impact on the corrupt practices and people of the world, rather than always trying to cloister itself and avoid being corrupted by the world? Do we realize that we're imitating the Pharisees precisely where Jesus came into conflict with them, rather than imitating Jesus?
That's a really pointed question, a good observation. So I had one more question before we sum up, and you already touched on it. So you can say, I said basically what I wanted to say, but I was going to ask how your findings from John's gospel compare to the best historically attested material in the synoptics. And you gave some examples of where we see themes of purification in the synoptics, though it isn't heavily emphasized.
That's right. Yeah, and there could be others. If you ask, what is it that just about everybody agreed on the basis of Leviticus rendered you impure? So we're not even talking about distinctive Pharisaic traditions, but Judaism as a whole. It was corpse impurity. It was impurity due to sexual emissions, bodily emissions of various kinds. It was impurity of what today would be called non-kosher foods. But then that would extend over to things like the need for self-immersion after becoming unclean for a variety of reasons. And you can find in Mark 5 to 6 alone, as you look at the accounts of the raising of Jairus' daughter, the demon-possessed man in Gadara. So there's the demonic, which was another key form of impurity. Mark's version of the feeding of the 5,000 early in Mark chapter 6, the beheading of John the Baptist and the disciples going out of their way to take the body and give it a proper burial. In 2 half chapters, you've got 4 passages that, if I'm thinking like first century Jew, I'm thinking, got to plan a week for staying away from everything holy and then having my ritual bath at the end. And there's none of that. And if anything, it's Jesus repeatedly purifying and cleansing, raising the young girl from the death, exorcising the demoniac, making him whole again, dealing tenderly with the woman and praising her faith, who was willing to touch him. No, that's not faith. That's corruption and disobedience. No, Jesus says that's faith. So yes, there's more of that than first meets the eye in the synoptics, because we don't think like first century Jews who care about purity.
Mhm. All right. Well, to wrap up, what if you could try to tie the conversation together, because we kind of split it into two halves.
Right.
If you could draw all this together, how would you sum up this conversation?
The historical Jesus and its quest is a worthwhile venture, because if I am not just talking to people who already believe in the reliability of the scripture, I need to take the discussion one step further and talk about standard historical criteria. If I do that, I discover that there still are a remarkable variety of perspectives on who Jesus is and was, so that we need to refine our criteria further. One of those criteria that perhaps has not always been used, or used as helpfully as it could, is what seems to cut against the grain of a given author's theological emphases. And when you apply that to John, you keep coming away with issues related to real bodily and moral, spiritual impurity and purity. When you look at the synoptics, you see not the same events, not a similar emphasis that suggests John just copied from the earlier synoptics, but you do see in a whole lot of other ways that same preoccupation, which suggests we may have two independent witnesses to a key theme that the church over the centuries has paid way too little attention to. And bringing it up to 2023 in a world where we're so fragmented and so politicized and so nasty to one another, at least in certain parts of the public sphere, if we could be known as the most winsome cross-section of human beings who go out of their way to bring that which is good and wholesome and positive and delightful and pure to all kinds of areas of sickness and ostracism and marginalization and corruption, maybe we'd have a bigger revival than Asbury had a few weeks ago.
That would be amazing. All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Blomberg, for having this conversation with me. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you for having me.
And I'd like to thank Baker for sending me a copy of the book. That was very kind of them, and I really enjoyed the book. I've put the link to the book in the description of this video, so if you want to explore this topic in more depth, just click on that link. Thank you for watching, and check out my whole playlist on the historical Jesus. I've interviewed people like Dr. Ben Witherington and now Dr. Blomberg, and I'm going to continue building this list out. So thank you very much for watching, and keep exploring Christianity.